The Unlikely Innovators with Mike Commito and Steve Gravel. Presented by Cambrian R&D and the Center for Smart Mining.
Mike, it seems like every week we hear about a new automaker that's making investments in the province of Ontario. So I think it's perfectly apt that we have Brian Kingston on the podcast. Brian, of course, is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association, representing the likes of Ford, GM, and Stellantis in Canada. It was a great chat with Brian.
Yeah, no, it really was, because from everything from Inflation Reduction Act, which Brian was able to bring to life to us, I think in a way that I think is meaningful, but also I think a little obviously concerning for, what we're kind of focused on right now when it comes to critical minerals in Ontario. So I think a lot of interesting nuggets to pull out of that one, where I think now your mind was kind of spinning, and we've since had some conversations after that chat today where we're starting to see just, how much of an impact this is going to make in the push that, that Ontario is trying to make to become that fully integrated EV supply chain. Whereas, but I don't want to take any win out of Brian's sale. So I'm not going to get too much into the Inflation Reduction Act, because I truthfully don't know as much as Brian does, which is why it was so great to have him on. But I mean, what else did you take away from that conversation? Obviously we knew going into it, we were going to have a great chat with Brian about, the role that the CVMA is playing, but seemed like there was even more, and we could have probably talked to him for longer than a half hour, but we didn't book him for long enough.
Yeah. Well, we want to be concise, we want to be pithy and quick, but no, I think despite some of the things that might be challenges within the IRA, I think it's good to be a mineral rich nation right now, like Canada is. I mean, there's a lot of opportunity out there, and there's a lot of reason for optimism. And I think that's sort of the key message that Brian gives us, is that the auto supply chain is here to stay more than ever with the advent of EVs, and we can look forward to more of those really cool announcements. So I think what we'll do now is we will stop talking and we'll go to Brian Kingston. Okay, and now we're back and we're joined by Brian Kingston. Brian is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the Canadian Vehicle Manufacturers Association. The CVMA represents Canada's leading manufacturers of light and heavy-duty motor vehicles. Its membership includes no less than Ford Motor Company of Canada, General Motors of Canada Company, and Stellantis. Prior to joining the CVMA, Brian was the President of Policy, Fiscal, and International at the Business Council of Canada, where he led the Council's economic policy priorities and global engagement. Brian holds a bachelor's degree in economics from Carleton University, a master's in international affairs from the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs, and an MBA from Ivy Business School, Go Mustangs. And now he is of course, a guest on the Unlikely Innovators. Brian, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. Great to be here.
So Brian, we typically ask a version of what did you want to be when you grew up when we start, but I think we'll add a bit of color to sort of direct you in a specific direction. You've worked in policy and government for a number of years. If you were looking at your sort of 10 to 15-year-old self, was automotive a destination that was likely? What drew you to the automotive sector from policy?
Yeah, it's a bit of a long and winding road. I've always been interested in the auto sector, but what really drew me in was my long-standing interest in economics and trade policy in particular. I just found even starting in high school, taking a high school economics course, I just found it a fascinating way to view the world and how it works. And hence, that's what led me to study economics and then eventually focus on international trade. And so I've always been working in the field of trade, largely when I was in the federal government, actually in the Trade Department, and then at the Business Council of Canada through the USMCA negotiations. And auto was always front and center. It's hugely important to the Canadian economy. It's hugely important to our trade relationships. And so I just found myself constantly being drawn into auto issues, although not directly working in the industry. And so when the opportunity came up to go and work at CVMA, it was a quick decision. I was super excited to learn more about the industry and actually get deeply involved in it. So it all stems from a love for economics, and here I am today.
Well, and I mean, in addition to economics, like you'd mentioned, obviously the importance of the auto sector to global trade, in Canada's global trade, but This is probably maybe an obvious question, but I'll let you kind of take it for a walk. Your studies in international affairs, I would assume that would be helpful, in your relatively new role at the CVMA. Can you talk about maybe how your background and interest in international affairs, will help prepare you for the tasks that lay ahead with this very important, trading avenue?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, what's fascinating about the auto industry is that it's truly global and it has one of the most expansive global supply chains of any industry. In Canada, in particular, our auto industry is highly integrated with North America. So, what that means is that international affairs, trade policy are always front and center considerations in this industry because of that cross-border integration. I mean, the stat that we've used for years at CVMA is that a part may cross the border 7 or 8 times before it's actually installed in a vehicle in the final assembly process. So having an understanding of global trade policy, having an understanding of some of the political dynamics that take place and how they impact the auto industry. I mean, a great example is just look what we've gone through over the past couple of years with the United States. There was an initiative at one point to have the U.S. consumer purchase incentive for electric vehicles apply only to U.S. assembled vehicles. These are the types of policies that can come up and have a real impact on the Canadian industry. So having a background in trade and politics has been really helpful in navigating this industry and ultimately making the case for the auto industry and the need for it to grow here in Canada.
And I think, in law, they say don't ask a question you don't know the answer to, but I'm going to try and put myself out there. But has it been common in past CVMA presidents that there was such a policy grounding? Like I just watched clips of Moneyball again for the first time in a bunch of years on TikTok, and how that was sort of like that sort of economics and data driven and policy driven thought process. Was that always how the CVMA is, or were they always like former auto sector people that would sort of jump in and be the president of this important organization?
Well, the previous president was in the role, Mark Nante, for I believe just over 30 years.
Wow.
So a long and illustrious career at CVMA. And it was interesting. I actually had a lot of interactions with the association when I was in the federal government working on trade policy and trade negotiations. And if there was one stakeholder who was always present and had a very strong voice in trade discussions, it was auto. That was well known, and it was CVMA. So I think there's a long history and respect for what the association brings. It's policy knowledge, it's trade knowledge, and of course, it's knowledge of the auto industry. And at least at the bureaucratic level that I was working at the time, it was pretty clear that you always had to understand where the auto industry was thinking and what its priorities were in the context of these trade negotiations, just given that, it's our second, if you look at our current export profile right now, our second largest export after oil is motor vehicles. So it's hugely important. So yeah, there's a long history of CVMA being engaged in sort of policy, economics, and trade.
And you mentioned some of the U.S. policy decisions, and how they are often made not necessarily in a bubble, but just not necessarily with incipiently thinking about the Canadian context. And one of the things that we keep hearing about, and our listeners are predominantly from mining, increasingly other sectors as well. But could you talk about the Inflation Reduction Act briefly? Maybe if we could just get that defined in basic terms, and then what does that impact the Canadian auto sector, and then just maybe talk about that a bit.
Sure. So the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, and poorly named, quite frankly, it's largely a climate change piece of legislation. $370 billion US, the majority dedicated to addressing climate change, and huge amounts earmarked for things like critical minerals development, auto industry retooling, and electric vehicle adoption. So this is a major piece of US legislation. It has significant impacts for the Canadian auto industry, some good, some challenging. On the good side, the very encouraging component of the IRA was that Canadian assembled electric vehicles are eligible for US consumer purchase incentives. This is huge. We've seen major investments in Canada by Ford, General Motors, and Stellantis. Just recently, we saw Ford confirm that Oakville will be a major hub for electric vehicle assembly. And given that over 90% of what we build in this country goes to the United States, it's pretty important that these vehicles can access US incentives. So that's really encouraging. There are also some provisions in there with respect to critical minerals sourcing, which has extremely positive potential for Canada, given our natural resource endowment. On the challenging side, the incentives that the United States has put forward, particularly to attract battery supply chain investment, are unprecedented. There is a production tax credit that is included in the IRA, which provides companies that assemble battery cell cathode materials in the United States a production incentive for the next decade. And so what that effectively means is that every battery that you assemble in the United States is going to attract this support. And so there are elements like that in this legislation, which are, they're good for the industry writ large in the transition to electrification, but they put the onus on Canada to really respond here. We're not going to attract as many battery plants as the US will. Of course not. We're a tenth of the size. But if we want to compete for a few of them, which we have to, then we're going to have to make sure that the playing field is level. So it's a big piece of legislation, positives and negatives for the Canadian economy.
Is there any I just want to drill down on that, on one piece of that. Is there any indication of how far down the supply chain that sort of mandate for American goes? Because one thing, like, as a student of history and particularly well, Mike and I both students of history of understanding natural resource wealth in Canada. I mean, we don't want to ship out raw materials anymore, but how far does that go? Given what we're seeing from our largest trading partners south of the border, I mean, we want to be participants in this supply chain, but we also want to have some value added product generation here in Canada.
Yes. Yeah. So what's encouraging is that it includes very specific sourcing requirements that actually apply to Canada and other US FTA partners on minerals. So if you want to qualify for the EV incentive, for example, over 40% of the critical minerals that are used in a vehicle need to be sourced from Canada, an FTA partner. For batteries, same thing, 50% of components. And the stringencies will actually ratchet up over time. So what the US administration is trying to do here is create a North American battery supply chain. Right now, we are highly, highly dependent on China. Over 80% of critical minerals processing is occurring in China. Very little of that activity happens in North America. So I think the challenge for Canada will be, we know we have the minerals. There's been much debate over how quickly we can actually activate approvals and get mines up and running. But then importantly, are we going to capture some of that additional value add by bringing some of that processing to Canada? You can do that, and under the scope of the IRA, it would still qualify for incentives. So I think that's where the big economic opportunity is. Build the mines, but also build out the associated supply chain and make sure that we're capturing as much value as possible. We've been very fortunate that with downstream, we've secured these investments in EV assembly plus major battery plants. So that's there. The question is, can we feed these facilities with Canadian produced inputs? I think we can, but we don't have much time. If you look at some of the targets that are being set by governments, I mean, we're talking about well over 50% of all new vehicles sold by 2030 should be electric. And so that's ambitious, and it gives us very little time to build out the supply chain.
Yeah, and one of the challenges, obviously, with some of those zero emission vehicle mandates is obviously, Steve and I here in Northern Ontario, we obviously have our local perch, but we know that Northern Ontario, and at least in our community, there's a big push for these vehicles. But we know from what we see here that the infrastructure is not ready to support that. And that's something that you've been vocal about as well, that these mandates, they're great and they're obviously ambitious, but without a national plan that's also focused on things like grid resiliency and changing infrastructure, what type of strategies do you think we need to have in order to at least meet, some of those targets that we've already set? Because without all of the support structures to go with that, that's great to meet that target. But if you can't actually support that and keep these vehicles on the road and going, that's not doing a whole heck of a lot of good.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And we're constantly reminding governments that at the end of the day, it is the consumer that decides what vehicle they want to drive, and they make that decision based on a range of factors. Usually it's price, obviously, and then convenience. What do you use your vehicle for? Do you go hunting? Are you a big camper? Do you have family that lives all over Ontario? I've got family down in southwestern Ontario on the shores of Lake Huron, and I can tell you, driving down there with two young kids, it's an undertaking, and you want to make sure you get it done as quickly as possible. So if you have charging challenges, people won't make the switch to electric. So at the end of the day, we have to ensure that consumers want to switch because they see the benefits. They see the benefits of not having to fuel their vehicle, and they find it convenient to charge at home if they can. If we don't address those barriers, though, and the price point remains higher without incentives, folks that don't have ability to charge a vehicle at home because they don't live in a detached home with a driveway, if they can't find a place to charge on the street or nearby, they won't make the switch. So government's keen to mandate what Canadians can and can't buy. We're making the case to them that we want this switch to be something that people want to do. So let's build out those supports. Let's provide the incentives. And really, if there's one thing that's keeping me up at night right now, it is the infrastructure. That is the big challenge. When you think about the ambition of these targets, you should be looking out your window anywhere in Canada and see people working nonstop on power lines and EV charging infrastructure, because we need literally millions of charging ports if you're going to support a fully electric fleet. And we're so far from being there right now. And that will be the barrier. That will be the thing that makes these targets unachievable.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's a time when we see gas stations closing down between large cities. And, you look outside, there's gas stations every, couple kilometers. We're not seeing the same thing with charging infrastructure at all. I think one of the funniest things we see at least I see in Northern Ontario is a lot of the big burly miners get in their huge pickup trucks made by some of your members, and then they drive to the mine site, park their gas vehicle, and then they get in an EV and drive underground all day. Maybe we need to sort of equalize those two sides eventually, and I think that's what we're going to see as the bigger class of vehicles start to electrify as well.
Yeah, well, and that's the exciting thing right now in this transition is that you're seeing from Ford, GM, and Stellantis electrified versions of extremely popular pickup trucks coming into the market. You already have the F-150 Lightning. We just got details on the Ram. Silverado is being electrified. And what's amazing about these vehicles is just that their utility capability performance is phenomenal, and really significant driving ranges as well, which I know was, that used to be a valid concern. Can you buy a vehicle that's going to give you the 400 or 500 kilometers of range? So the technology is advancing rapidly, and I'm hoping it'll get to a point where that miner drives their electrified pickup to the mine, and then they go down and they're driving electrified machinery as well. I think we're getting close to that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I'd buy a Ford Ranger tomorrow if they had an electric version of it. I know that they had one as a demo in the late 90s. You could buy a Ford Ranger, or you could see a Ford Ranger EV. But I love the Ranger platform, and I would buy one tomorrow if they had it. I'm sure they'll roll that out soon, but F-150 is the most popular, obviously.
Yeah.
I thought you'd be breaking news for us today that they're releasing the Ranger soon, but I'll save you from that obligation. I think we're a trades and technology college, and one of the things we always have our eye on is are we making the right student skill profile for the future? And sometimes it could take, it's like turning the Titanic around to get our skills in line with what industry needs. What are some of your and it's changing, right? I mean, we like to say that you'll still need to know how to crimp a hydraulic hose to be able to work on electrified heavy equipment, but that's not going to be the case forever. You're bringing your laptop to a maintenance call, more so than your tool bag. And it seems the same with, above ground on highway EVs. What are you seeing in the skills profile for essentially, your members at the plant? Are we seeing a change that is noteworthy, that needs a lot of reskilling, and where are they going to get all those people for those new assembly plants?
Yeah, well, first, just on the actual demand, there's been some really good analysis done by a group called Focal on the auto industry labor market. And like many industries, what you'll find is that with looming retirements, there's going to be a significant demand, tens of thousands of jobs that need to be filled in the coming years. And then you add on top of that some of the new investments into battery plants and in the supply chain. And it's exciting. There are going to be big opportunities here for Canadians. When it comes to the type of skills, obviously with electrification, it does require a different skill set than what you would have in a traditional gas-powered ice plant. And what really strikes me is, as you walk around a plant floor now, you're more likely to see someone carrying a tablet, monitoring the various machines that are working, fully automated, as opposed to what you would have seen 20 or 30 years ago, where people were still doing, an element of manual physical labor on the line. So what that means is for programs that are training people, it's incorporating that technological element to it, obviously incorporating the new powertrain and what's required for assembling EVs as opposed to ICE. So yeah, there is a need for reskilling and making sure that the educational programs in Canada that have traditionally fed into the auto industry are updating their curriculum to make sure they're preparing for these new vehicle mandates that are coming to the plants in Ontario.
On these podcasts with an autofocus, I always hate saying things like changing gears, but I do love it because why not? But we've already touched on this, Brian, but I'll downshift to bring this back into the conversation. See, I've done it twice now. See, you just got to lean into it. But
tap the brakes on that stuff.
Well, now we're going overboard now. But you mentioned critical minerals, Brian, and this is obviously something that's of vital importance to Ontario and the country at large. And especially here in Ontario, but in Canada, we've boasted about how we have all of the mineral wealth necessary to become an integrated EV supply chain. Obviously, that's very interesting, to a place like Sudbury that has a lot of these critical minerals that are going to be necessary, to support these ZEV mandates in the future. But can you talk about what your members are saying about sourcing local battery materials, whether it's here in Ontario or across the country, and how important that will be, to the success and likelihood of us achieving these goals and meeting these mandates?
It's hugely important, and sourcing in North America in particular is a huge priority. And all you have to do is just look at some of the announcements that auto companies have been making. And I speak obviously for my members, but if you look at some of the announcements from other global automakers that are showing a real interest in Canada, that's indicative of both the potential that Canada has because of our mineral endowment, but also because of the sourcing requirements that the U.S. has put forward in the IRA. If you want to qualify for these incentives and be part of this, the U.S. is a major automotive market, you've got to be sourcing from North America. And Canada is really the only place for some of these minerals where that can be done. So that is a huge, huge economic opportunity. The challenge is, can we actually take advantage of the opportunity in the relatively short time frame that we have? We know the timelines that it takes in Canada to do big things, to undertake major projects. It is a challenge. It's been well recognized, and we just saw it recognized in the federal budget again that a 10 to 15 year approval process for a mine is not going to work. But what we're missing is tangible ideas to shorten that while still making sure that we're protecting our environmental standards and we're undertaking consultations with Indigenous communities. We have to do this right, but we have to do it right and quickly. And I'm not going to pretend I know the answer. I'm not a mining expert, but that to me is the big challenge, because I really hope that if you have me on this podcast in 10 years, we're not talking about the same things and the lost opportunity as we see other jurisdictions ramp up their capacity. And this is highly competitive. Well, Canada has these minerals. The U.S. is currently in the process of negotiating they're calling them free trade agreements, but they're effectively small bilateral agreements that will allow other countries to be part of the IRA sourcing requirements. So one of these has just been struck with Japan, talks with Indonesia. So it's not as though the US is sitting still, kind of saying, all right, we're just going to wait for Canada to kind of get moving and become a supplier here. There are other countries that can do this. So we've got to move. We've got to move right now.
Yeah, and thank you for putting that into perspective, because I think there's a misconception out there that there's going to be so much global demand that we can afford to be second or third or fourth. But I keep telling people that's not the case. We can, there is gradations of winning at this game, but the gradations of losing it get worse as it goes further and further down. So I think we're another question that we sort of have, and as someone who follows sort of economic history, and if you were to ask me if it would even be in the discussion if these companies like Ford and others, GM, would be looking at becoming more vertically integrated than they have been, I would be pretty shocked. But we've actually heard rumblings of auto companies that will remain nameless that are actually looking at buying stakes in mining companies. I'll ask you to look in your crystal ball for a second. What do you think the likelihood that we see a major auto manufacturer, we can speak in general terms, actually having like either a majority or strong minority stake in a mining firm in Canada to sort of secure some of that supply? And do you think it makes sense for these companies that have relied on the auto parts manufacturers in a very horizontally integrated way to be that vertical? A lot of in there, but just if you're
yeah. Look, I think it is. I think it is a possibility that you'll see auto manufacturers becoming more directly involved, and potentially even, becoming minority shareholders in some of these mining companies. And the reason I say that is because there is a real scramble to secure these required inputs. And if you look, there's a fascinating study out right now by Benchmark Minerals Intelligence that's looking at global demand for batteries and then their associated inputs through to 2035. They're estimating that if we're going to achieve the EV sales objectives and targets that are being set globally, we're going to need 300 new mines by 2035. I mean, just imagine that, the scale of that, 300 new mines. That's the production that's necessary to have the graphite and the lithium and the nickel and cobalt that's going to be required for these batteries. So in that context, where you've got this scramble for these resources, I think you will see interesting approaches by companies to ensure that they've got a consistent, secure supply of these inputs going forward. And what you're seeing in the industry, really, we saw this initially through COVID and the global semiconductor shortage, our desire to have more transparency into the supply chain to avoid situations like that, right? The semiconductor shortage, hard to predict, obviously. I don't think many people were predicting a global pandemic, but who would have thought we'd be in a situation here years later where we still have semiconductor shortages and it's having an impact on vehicle inventories. So, I think the lesson there is having more transparency into the supply chain, more sort of early warning systems, if you will, on when there may be input shortages is going to be a really smart business strategy going forward. So I hope that answers some of it. I don't want to make any overly bold predictions, but I think
of course
we'll see more integration.
No, I think that's great. I think what and maybe we'll end on this, Brian, but one thing that sort of struck me as we were talking, is it overstated to say that the EV consumer of the future, I always hear that, that it's important for auto manufacturers to source local, not only for all those incentives, but the EV consumer of the future really will care from an ethical perspective where the minerals in their vehicle were sourced from. Are you seeing that be as important as those, or are we overstating how important that is in North America and Europe and other sort of well-known ethical consumers, essentially?
I think it is important, and I think it will become increasingly important. And all you have to do is look at the various initiatives that auto manufacturers are taking with respect to supply chain transparency. Consumers want to know where the inputs and materials that are in their vehicle are coming from, and so you're seeing more and more of that tracking and tracing being done throughout the supply chain. I don't see that shifting that trend. So I think there will be a drive for that. The other important point, just on localization, of course, with batteries, given their size and weight, you generally don't want to be moving these things extremely long distances, right? Shipping something from Asia via ship to North America for assembly is probably not going to be an outcome that most companies are going to be striving for. So I think you will see, just on that basis, and like we've seen it in Ontario, you have the assembly plant, and then that creates a whole ecosystem of parts suppliers close by, because we've got a just-in-time manufacturing process, and it creates efficiencies. So I think you're going to see the consumer push, the companies doing their own supply chain transparency initiatives, plus just the economics of this industry requiring assembly to be done in a relatively localized place.
Well, Brian, like I think you've been so generous with your time today. We'll have to end it there. I mean, there's so much more we could talk about, and I think we'll have an opportunity to do that in Sudbury at the end of May and June. And I think your point about how, if we were to have you back in 10 years, which we'd welcome, hopefully we're having a very different conversation. We're not asking you the same things again, because that would mean we've missed out on this this generational opportunity.
Exactly. Yep. And look forward to seeing you at the conference in Sudbury.
Right on. Thanks so much for your time, Brian. Appreciate it.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Brian. Steve, I'm going to bring your Moneyball reference and the current critical mineral strategy together now, and I hope that this resonates with you. Adapt or die.
That's exactly right.
That's Billy Bean's. You know, that's what he says to his scouting staff when they're, you know, resistant to his analytics-based approach. But I think much like Billy Bean in the Oakland Athletics, like right now in Canada and Ontario, like there's a really, like as you've said, a generational opportunity when it comes to critical minerals. And if we don't change the way that we're currently just digging holes in the ground and sending raw materials elsewhere, like adapt or die. We have to look at how to fully integrate to really take advantage of this opportunity. So that's
I think look, if folks like Ford that make gas pickup trucks can retrofit a line of F-150s to make electric vehicles in Oakville, then surely we can get minerals out of the ground faster than we are and processed here locally. So I'm optimistic that we'll get this right. The opportunity is great enough for us to do that. So, but thank you for rescuing my Moneyball analogy. Hopefully people understand what I was talking about. And if not, you know,
I read the book by Michael Lewis, and I honestly probably watch Moneyball, I would say like once a quarter. So
yeah, it's one of those
I watch
ones
it
you
like
have to go back
four or five times a year. Sometimes it's just in the background while I'm like doing notes or other things, but like it's up there for me as like one of my go-tos for sure.
Well, and as an economist, I'm sure Brian has probably read the book and watched it, but not to say that he's PD, but you know, there's a lot of analytics that can be applied to a lot of different situations. So
yeah, and I mean, I think this would probably be a good time for you to maybe plug the Minds to Mobility BEV in Depth conference that Brian will be at. We kind of did tease it a little bit at the end of our conversation with Brian, but maybe now before the listeners log off. I mean, they're definitely still here because that Moneyball reference landed. That was like
that's what that's why people are sticking around. So
for me to pat myself on the back for an analogy I did. So yeah, there you go.
Yeah, there you go. But of course on May 31st and June 1st at Cambrian College here in Sudbury, we're going to be bringing together the battery electric vehicle supply train, the automotive I think I said supply train.
You did, but like I keep it rolling.
Supply chain, as well as the mining and minerals supply chain. So Brian is actually on a panel, and if you like any of the things he said today, you can ask him a lot of questions when you come to that event. Tickets will go on sale on Tuesday, April 18th.
There you go. So check back for that. But otherwise, I think it's time for the supply train to leave the station.
Choo choo.
We'll see you next time.
Bye.
The Unlikely Innovators with Mike Commito and Steve Gravel. Presented by Cambrian R&D and the Center for Smart Mining.